everyone? Are we ready to go? Are we go? Yes, I think we are. Okay, welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Just a quick reminder, this morning we were talking, I think, a lot about the way that digital technology and audiences come together. I think we've heard a lot at the start about the new ways in which people are engaging and the challenges that perhaps that holds. We heard Microsoft's vision, and I think to an extent Twitter's analysis of how they think people are about the new ways in which people are interacting with content and what that means to business today, to social relationships today. This afternoon, I think we're going to be talking in this first session about archives, and I think it's one of those paradoxes of the digital world, actually, that it's not all about creating new links for future content all the time. A lot of it is about recreating or finding links with the vast wealth of content that's actually out there already and has been sitting around perhaps unused, activating and reactivating our own history and culture. And I think that's the session. What we're going to do is the same format with the session here, where we've got three speakers. We have Jake Berger from BBC Archive. We have Dafydd Tudor from the National Library of Wales, and we have David Anderson from the National Museum of Wales. And what we'll do is the same again. We'll have presentations followed by discussion afterwards. So if you can keep those tweets going, it was very interesting the way that the last conversation was driven by questions from you via Twitter. So feel free, in fact, feel encouraged to send your questions in. So if we could start off with Jake Berger.
Hello, I must warn you, I've had a bit of a cough recently, as you might have heard, so if I turn away from the microphone and have a coughing fit, please excuse me, I'll try not to die. 2,500 years ago, the citizens of Athens had greater access to archives than we have today. Any citizen could go into the metroon, the remains of which are there, which held all of the important political, administrative and cultural documents which were held by the state. And they could go in there, they could copy the material, they could read the material. The times have changed. There are now too many metroons, and only a select few people are allowed to enter them, and very rarely are you allowed to make a complete copy of something when you go there. You might be allowed in, but that's about it. However, the internet has the capability to change all of this, and as people increasingly assume that if something isn't on Google that it doesn't actually exist, we kind of need to work together to let the internet change this and agree a way to make it happen, to create a digital metroon, so that we can catch up with the Athenians of 500 BC and enjoy a fuller access to our cultural heritage. But why bother? What's the point? Well, there are many reasons why. I won't read them out for you, but for me the most important ones are the three at the top. Because we can. I mean, nobody really knows what happens when you step into this kind of arena, and often the best things emerge when nobody knew what was going to happen when you started. Fundamentally, as a principle, I think making available to the public the material that you and your ancestors over generations have paid for and is now held on your behalf, and to connect people to the things that they care about, to allow those millions of obscure interests and interested people to join the things about which they're passionate. So I'll try and get a little bit specific now, a bit less of the woolly stuff. I'm from the BBC. We have loads and loads of stuff, and we have more and more stuff, thousands of new items every day. And it's our team in archive development at the BBC whose role is to make it and other people's archives as available as possible. Thousands of institutions, large and small, have got loads of stuff themselves. And billions of people too. I bet everybody here has got boxes, dusty boxes up in the loft or in the basement containing personal archives, whether they're yours or your parents or your grandparents. And I also guarantee that someone, somewhere out there amongst the 7 billion on the planet would be very interested to see each of those items. The trick is connecting them together. So what would actually happen if we opened up all of these archives, brought them together, made them findable and usable? I don't normally like reading stuff off slides, but I'm going to read this slide. Our mission is to connect people to their own personal archives from amongst the trillions of items held on their behalf, letting them tell us about it, storing their insights, and helping them to travel across diverse realms on journeys of understanding and discovery. If nothing else, it would probably make a lot of people very happy. But what would it be like? I'm going to do another slide reading. This is the last one, I promise. If you bear with me as I read out this rather long sentence, but it's something that we've honed in on over the last few years as the tightest possible description of what we're specifically trying to achieve. So imagine that much of the UK's publicly held cultural and heritage media assets and data could be found in a unified online space, connected together, searchable, open, accessible, visible and usable, in a way that allows individuals, institutions and machines to add additional material and additional meaning and context to each other's media, indexed and tagged to the highest level of detail. And this emerging vision of a free-to-everyone open access environment for creative for learning and creative endeavour has been referred to as a digital public space. There are 6 principles which underpin digital public space, which I will run through quickly. What goes into a digital public space should stay there forever at the same location on the internet. Everything should be accompanied by as much information as possible. Some of this is useful to people, some to machines, and therefore to people. Finding out about something should be free to everybody forever, even though accessing the media itself might not always be free. You need to know that it's there. The underlying technology must be built on open standards, not just because it's a nice thing to do, but it will make things sustainable on the long term. And a digital public space should never ask for more information from an individual or institution than is necessary or useful. And finally, the principle of universality must be retained. So, how can you make this happen? It's quite straightforward in principle. If everybody follows and adopts the same standards, it will simply work. Digitize it, describe it in a machine-readable, structured manner, publish it online using linked open data principles, and almost most importantly, enable association, augmentation, and amplification from users and publish this new data as per above. What that basically means is let people tell you things about this, about your holdings, about your assets, and make their insights available. We at the BBC are doing a few projects in the area which should help make all of this happen. I'll talk about just a few of them. This horrific-looking diagram was a thankfully successful attempt to prove to ourselves that very diverse archive catalogues could be joined together in a single data model. For those of you who are interested in whose collections there, includes the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew, so listing every known plant, the Science Museum, National Archives, Royal Opera House, National Library of Scotland, and the British Library's National Bibliography. So everything that they hold in their specialist realms can be brought together in a relatively simple data model. If it didn't work, then we would have packed up our bags and gone home. So it was one of the first things we did. So what this really demonstrates is that no matter how big and important or small and obscure your collection is, it can fit in alongside all of the others. One of the projects we have at the moment is called the Research and Education Space. It's a BBC Archive development project working with BBC Wales and GISC, who are the people who run the academic networks and have the fastest network in the entire world, and the British Universities Film and Video Council. And RES aims to make a wide range of archive material available primarily for use by learners. So in January we made 800,000 hours of BBC Archive television and radio, everything the BBC's broadcast since 2007, available to students, which is the largest ever release of BBC material to a potential audience of millions. The next phase of it involves creating an aggregation platform, which is essentially, it will identify material out there on the internet which is semantically described as linked open data, so we're following our own instructions. It will analyse them, cluster them together, and make that analysis available. So what it should do is make it easier for people to build products and services that can look across diverse sets of archive catalogues through a single source. Genome, which will make available the Radio Times in digitised format. So a few years ago we started scanning every copy we had of the Radio Times, and we now have structured data listing about 5 million programmes, which is everything we've intended to broadcast since 1922. This is going to be published online within the next few months and will provide the spine of data with which the BBC's actual archives, and not the stuff we said we were going to be broadcast, but any recordings of it, which it can be associated with. And when we launch, we'll be inviting members of the public, anybody on the internet, to help correct the numerous optical character recognition errors that emerge when you're scanning 5 million pages, sorry, 5 million programs, and also to tell us things about the programs. There's lots and lots of other things that we're doing, and I welcome contact from anybody who wants to find out more or share your ideas or get involved. Thanks for listening, and as a reminder, there's your back. There's your instructions. Get busy.
Okay, we'll move on to Daff Tudor.
Pnawn da, good afternoon. I'm Daryl Tudur, and I'm very pleased to be here with you. Although, when I was asked to prepare something on the theme of exploiting our digital archives, I can't say that I was entirely comfortable. According to the National Library Supplemental Charter, our core objects as an institution are to collect, preserve, and give access to all kinds of and forms of recorded knowledge for the benefit of the public. I have a PowerPoint presentation that I was hoping would be here. I'll carry on anyway. But and access and openness are principles that have underpinned our approach to digitization from the beginning. So we're not used to speaking in the language of exploitation, which I do tend to view in commercial terms, but I also accept that it doesn't necessarily have to be seen as such. Nevertheless, we can't ignore the fact that the library's range of digital collections have become a valuable asset in recent years. And in facing the realities of our current economic circumstances, we're obliged to explore, if not exploit, the commercial potential of those collections more than ever before. The National Library of Wales's attitude towards the emergence of digital technologies has been heavily influenced by the fact that we're situated in a town in the heart of rural Wales, which has a population of about 25,000 people, almost half of whom are students at the university. Most of these collections are in physical or analog form, and are over an hour's travel from most of Wales's population. So it's little wonder that we embraced with open arms the potential of digital technology as means of widening access to our collections. Last year, we launched 2 of our largest and most ambitious digitisation projects to date, Welsh Newspapers Online and Cymru 1914. And they're the latest and the largest in a series of digitisation projects, which have not only created 6 million digital objects, but have allowed us to develop the in-house capacity to digitise as many as 30,000 pages a week. And here are some examples of the items that have been digitised. I should note that they also include a great deal of maps, and that we also have large collections of moving images and sound recordings. Regardless of how we exploit these digital collections, the main challenges are, as I see them, to ensure sufficient resources to continue to digitise material, to maintain our current capacity and sustain the level of preservation and access to those digital collections, and secondly, to address the legal restrictions, copyright in particular, that apply to the materials in our collections, regardless of the commercial intent or value of those materials. But I'm going to focus on a challenge that arises at the other end of the process and has a very strong influence on the extent to which we, as an organisation and others, can create the compelling new experiences for old and new audiences that are described in the session introduction. From the outset, the library's embracing of digital technologies has been coupled with a commitment to making available digitised collections that are free at the point of access, without paywalls, without registration. But of course, users not only want to see, they want to use. And so when the movement to enable the reuse of digital content under open licenses, such as Creative Commons, began to gain momentum, the library was again among those organisations that were early adopters. We responded positively to that vision. It was purely seen as a way in which we could fulfil our core object of giving access to our collections more effectively. In 2009, we became the first cultural organisation in the UK to contribute to Flickr Commons. One example, and the rest of the images in my presentation will be selected from our Flickr Commons photo stream, where they've been freed from copyright restrictions. They also come from the collection of the photojournalist Jeff Charles, who assigned copyright to the National Library of Wales shortly before his death. We've also contributed selections of our photographic collections to Wikipedia, and when People's Collection Wales was launched in 2010, all of our images were licensed under the Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share Alike license. Then came the decision in spring 2012 that we would no longer claim ownership of copyright in digital reproductions per se, a policy that's been fully implemented on our Welsh Newspapers Online and the Cymru 1914 websites that were launched last year. I should also mention that all the metadata that we have created for our catalogues has been released under a CC0 license. And then in 2003, last year, the library was announced the winner of Wikimedia UK's GLAM of the Year, Galleries, Libraries, Archives and Museums of the Year, for our support for the movement's aims. So the direction has been clear for several years, but we're very much still in the process of opening our collections and removing restrictions, unnecessary restrictions to the access and use of those collections. And despite these developments in recent years, it still requires a significant change of mindset, as well as changes to our policies and procedures, and that's going to take time. But also, it's a position that will become more difficult to maintain due to the change in our economic circumstances. Which brings me back to the point that I made at the beginning of exploiting the commercial potential of our collections, and the title of my presentation, The Value of Being Open. Does open access create more value to the library, and more importantly to the public, than the income that would be generated if they were not open? And what does being open actually mean in practice, after all? Decisions were made in the past very carefully. They were carefully made decisions. But the case for being open needs to be reasserted once again. There needs to be a clear rationale. In fact, there does need to be a business case behind it, and it needs to be fundamental to our strategic planning. The library's strategic plan, Knowledge for All, which was launched in April, outlines our vision for the people of Wales everywhere to be connected to knowledge that can make a difference to their lives. And the principle of open access is key to that vision. So for the time remaining, I'm going to run through the library's priorities of the next 3 years, each of which I believe is facilitated, supported, or strengthened by our commitment to being open with our collections. It's only going to be a brief overview, but it should give you an idea of where we are at the moment, how we are thinking, and where we aspire to be. Access has already been presented as the main driver behind our digitisation activities over the last few years. But this includes not only widening access by increasing the number of items available online, it also relates to the quality of those digital items in terms of resolution, image quality, the metadata associated with it, the format, etc. And in order to improve what we have to offer, we need to engage with audiences and understand how they want to access and use that information. And as we identify areas of improvement, there may also be an opportunity to look at the messages that the library is conveying as part of that process, how the collections are being presented to audiences, and how information can be gathered about their use of those services and collections in the future. Part of our strategy is to open new physical access points to the library and strategic sites across Wales. In a digital context, we see this as proactively sharing our collections where they're likely to be discovered and used by a greater number and a wider range of audiences. I've already mentioned Flickr Commons, where our collections are gaining much more exposure than they would on our own web services. Also Wikipedia and the People's Collection, but we're also sharing on Europeana and Wikimedia Commons. And by adopting a proactive approach to sharing collections on third-party services, we can determine how they are presented and perhaps direct users back to those services that we provide and what we have to offer, and those many collections that we are unable to provide access to online. The library holds many of the nation's treasures, from the earliest manuscripts written in the Welsh language to the largest collection of original Catherine Williams works. And in the past, I think we've allowed our role to be defined primarily by the collections that we hold. But as you find in other cultural organisations, there is a great deal of knowledge and expertise within the National Library that enhances understanding of the collections that are held. There is also knowledge in areas such as research skills, information management, digitisation, digital preservation, that are also valuable and can be shared and transferred. Being open directs our attention perhaps away from the collections and towards our audiences and to what we have to offer in terms of expertise and services, as well as the information itself. We begin to see ourselves less as keepers and more as facilitators, working alongside or even better with our users in advancing knowledge and the management of information, especially relating to Wales and its people. Which leads to the third priority in our strategy, collaboration. Combined with our expertise and capacity for digitisation, our desire to open the collections creates opportunities for collaboration. The library was the lead partner in the Cymru 1914 project that was launched last year, which had, I believe, 8 organisations contributing content to that project, and data from which has been used in the new Lives of the First World War project, which was launched about 10 days ago. We're also one of the key partners in the Cynnig project, which is led by the Archives and Records Council Wales, which will digitise tithe maps covering the whole of Wales. And again, the data from which we aim to make as open as possible. Very soon we'll be announcing a new collaboration with that will make our digital collections available for prospective R&D projects in the arts And our research program also includes projects based on digital collections, which involve experimenting with crowdsourcing and linked data. And the collaboration isn't limited to the public sector either. Our Digitisation for Business project, yw'r, has opened our digital collections for use by SMEs across Wales. Specialising in music technology apps, to develop an app that will enable its user to learn the Welsh National Anthem in not only the melody itself, but in one of the other parts, alto, tenor, bass. And what we're able to do in working with them is to put a historical context to that, combine that tool with images from our collections so that its users can learn about its history as well. Of course, openness and sustainability have a close relationship, but in an economic context, sometimes openness, being open, is seen as undermining potential income streams. But I believe that collaboration actually creates opportunities for income generation in this sense. It's project funding that has made possible our digitisation of 6 million items, and it's very likely to continue to be the main source of income after the grant from the Welsh Government. But other revenue streams can be developed, and we are exploring them without curtailing access. Requests for high-resolution versions of images have increased significantly in recent years, and there are other services such as digitisation on demand, the supply of high-quality prints that could be explored further. The library's skills and expertise could be monetised in the form of consultancy and training, or as premium services such as research, rights clearance, our digitisation services. And there are also opportunities to attract interests from sponsors and donors. If our key message is that we're opening up the collections for the benefit of the public, then it's a very positive message to be giving. And our hope is that there will, that we will attract sponsors and donors as a result. And the fifth point in our strategy is forward-thinking, blaengaredd. As a result of a combination of economic and technological factors, the National Library of Wales, like many libraries, may be facing the most challenging time in its history, and it's vital that we think clearly and positively about the future. The subtle but significant shift from an outlook that focuses on our collections to one that's based on meeting the needs of our users places the library in a better position to establish its role within Wales's emerging information economy, not only as a source of information about Wales and its people, but also an organisation serving the people of Wales, playing a key role in connecting them with the knowledge that can make a difference to their present-day lives, as well as engage them with their past. To conclude, I stated earlier that there needs to be a clear rationale for being open, and I sought to give you an idea of how openness supports and strengthens the library's strategy for the next 3 years. But there remains no clear framework for defining and measuring the value that cultural organisations are generating downstream as a result of providing open access to their collections. And so, beginning today, I felt that this was a good opportunity to begin. 2 colleagues who lead the library's Digital Collections Research Programme, Professor Lorna Hughes and Dr. Owen Roberts, and myself will be undertaking a research project entitled yw'r, or Be Open. The aim of this project will be to gather information and evidence that will advance the development of methods and tools for measuring the value and impact of digital collections that are being shared openly. And my hope is that the outputs but also encourage other archive holders, other organisations that have not yet been persuaded of the value of being open to enable their audiences to exploit their digital collections, and that's to their mutual benefit. And that's where if you would be interested in working with us on that project, then please do get in touch with me. I'd be very pleased to hear from you. Thank you.
Fascinating stuff. David, maybe you could finish off the National Museum of Wales.
The removal of the laptop. I hope that what I have to say will complement the two previous speakers, Jake and David. I will say a little bit about a few projects very briefly, but principally I want to try to step back and take a view about questions of distinctiveness within the United Kingdom of Wales's contribution, which I know has been touched on, but I want to talk a bit more about that. And also some of the broader questions and challenges that the heritage sector arguably faces too. Wales, of course, has very few large national cultural institutions compared with England. I worked in national museums in England for 25 years and managed to be part of, lead two significant collaborative projects, one for 9 national museums and another one with a broadcaster, a research institute at a university and museum. And I do know the near impossibility of bringing coherence and collaboration to the cultural sector in England. It's a mighty struggle to get any collaborative projects off the ground. Scotland with the Scran project in bringing a unity to a digital project that provided opportunities for small institutions as well as large in Scotland to work together. I mean, it's had its sort of challenges over the years, but nevertheless it was a beacon very early on for that kind of work. And in Wales, when I first came about 4 years ago, I was hugely impressed by Wales's achievements in having established People's Collection Wales as a collaborative project, and one which was very strongly rooted in sort of local communities as well. A bit more about that later. But also I was struck by the distinctive nature of culture in Wales, the fact that it is so much more communal very often than what I'd experienced in England. Of course, the distinctiveness of questions of language, and also the very strong traditions of participation, which I think links with a lot of the debates that are happening at the moment about cultural rights. Cultural rights do not exist if they do not offer opportunities for participation and influence over the outcome of the cultural product. That's a concept which is very alien to many national cultural institutions in London, but it's something which is much better embedded in Wales. And this means that Wales has the capacity to develop different solutions and different outcomes than would be possible in some other countries. We have the potential also to be innovative and quicker, perhaps sometimes, in developing such projects. And again, I'd say People's Collection Wales is a case in point. Innovation, in some respects, can be easier in Wales than it is elsewhere, despite the fact that the resources may be fewer. And I would also say, sort of looking at what David, for example, has just been saying, for the National Library, but also if one thinks of National Theatre Wales and other cultural organisations too, that there is a much greater unity of purpose in Wales around the public responsibilities of cultural organisations than I ever found in England. I have to say, for the whole of the sort of the online world, though, we are all still far too linear and transmission mode in our mentalities of how digital can be developed. And we do have to work out a good marriage, really, of partnership through centralisation on the one hand and through respect for the local, the regional and the nations within the UK on the other. And I know it's an issue that the BBC, for one, is struggling with. I mentioned the People's Collection Wales, and the National Museum is the lead partner for management of that project. It's a partnership between cultural heritage bodies in Wales, with nearly 50,000 photographs, sound archives and stories on it already, and growing daily. It's accessible to anyone to contribute material, reuse content and share, and that's a crucially important element of it. It's a very important platform for collaboration. And it provides training to community groups and local organisations to help them to upload their content and contribute to it as well. So I do think there's a lot of really significant and not that common elements to that project, which that organisation, in fact, really, which should be cherished and which can be built upon. We'll hear tomorrow about the iBeacons projects as well, and some of the ways in which proximity sensors can be used in specific cultural context, in this particular case the National Slate Museum, and the richness of data and the richness of engagement really that this innovation can bring. And we're very proud that the National Slate Museum is the first cultural institution in the UK, and I think jointly with just one other in the world, really, to develop this. And it is an example of how Wales can be very fleet-footed on doing projects of this kind. And there is a way in which potentially then microlocation can be used to provide multiple views and narratives, simultaneously to users, insights, capacity to favourite certain items in galleries, and to get to know much more about our users than we would do otherwise. I want to mention also the St Fagans digital strategy, which has the ambition to have the open, democratic and participatory nature of the web in a physical gallery context. And this is, if you like, in this sense, the web and what can be learned from the web has powerfully influenced thinking about how a gallery can be developed and made available to visitors as well. We want, through this project, to diminish the boundaries between online and physical space, and I want to come back to that. And also, we want to enable interpretation to be fluid rather than fixed during the lifetime of gallery. In fact, in a sense, to be constantly adapting, responding, and growing as users, visitors are present in the spaces. And to use mechanisms and vocabulary of social media, such as profile, link, follow, like, and share, in the gallery itself. There's a project that we've done on Flickr and Twitter, which is to post images of World War I postcards and get the public to help us to transcribe them. The museum also had the Ghost Slug project, an alien slug, which there was a lot of inquiries about, and we turned that into a research project through digital media to help the public to contribute to the research. And also crowdsourcing, which the museum is doing with the Art Fund to help to raise funds for St Fagans as well. One of the really crucial challenges we face, though, is how to bring together the work of cultural organisations in Wales. And People's Collection Wales is really, for us, the trailblazer on this, but there is a lot more that we can do. And one initiative which the National Museum is leading at the moment is to develop a digital heritage strategy for Wales, to try to facilitate creativity and learning, to enhance social inclusion and promote sustainability of the Welsh heritage digitally as well. And there's a whole range of challenges which lie below this new initiative, which is just getting off the ground, not least of which is establishing standards for preservation and public engagement that don't just lie within sectors, the museum sector, the library sector, but actually cut across sectors as well to enable content to be shared across sectors. So, for example, the National Library has some very fine Welsh art collections. The National Museum has the same. It's really crucially important from the public's point of view that we're operating across our platforms, really, to enable that to be available simultaneously. So I think that the development of a digital heritage strategy for Wales will again be a first, I think, in the United Kingdom in the form in which it'll happen, and as an example of where, because there are fewer of us, we can maybe do more as well. I want to argue for the value of heritage cultural institutions in the digital world. One of the arguments, I think, is a generic one. It's one the BBC, for example, would be very familiar with. It is of public service. And with the licence fee debate coming up soon, I'm sure this is an issue which is going to exercise the BBC very considerably. We heard through Jake's presentation as well, I think, some of the principles of public service articulated in particular to the RES project. But those principles are vitally important, and they are universal, and I'll come back to those in a minute too. It is crucial that the public service, in my view, continues to thrive and grow and be strong, because we have the responsibility to be a sanctuary for truths, not for truth, but for truths. And this is vital in a world in which commercial interests do not necessarily have the same responsibility and the same commitment. So for me, the survival of the public service in the digital world, in the heritage world, is vital for democracy. But it's also vital that digital institutions, as public service institutions, rethink themselves in the digital age. And this, again, is where Wales, I think, can contribute something special, if not unique. For example, in all the work that we do around co-production, the St Fagans Museum is being developed very substantially as a co-production project. Virtually everything that is being decided and virtually everything that is being designed through consultation and co-production with a very wide range of groups across Wales. Over 200 different organisations and groups are being consulted or have been consulted so far on the project. And that's an ongoing process, and it will not stop when the new museum development itself opens. It will be an integral part of our way of working. But it's vital that that should be an integral part of our digital work as well as everything else. And I think, secondly, a shift from the authoritarian cultural institution to the authoritative one role is yet more important, because there is a sense that the coalition in Westminster is somehow disenchanted with public service and believes that many of its functions could be done better by the private sector. It's up to us to challenge that through the quality of what we do, not just through rhetoric. And I do believe that there are things that can only be done by the public sector in the heritage field, and that some of the most interesting innovations in cultural terms come through maybe use of technologies in partnership with the commercial sector, but nevertheless rely upon the distinctive understandings that the heritage sector has of objects, of works of art, of oral history, of people's memories, and everything else that makes up culture. But if we argue for public service, we also need to, I think, step up our game in another way, which is that we should also regard ourselves as a vocation. There's not a word that's used in the heritage sector very much, but it is one that I think really does apply. We have a responsibility, not just as organizations, but also as individuals, in the same way as other vocations do, to do what is right for the public, above and beyond all other pressures and difficulties. And if the public service is to survive, it is going to survive because it has many, many individuals working within it who feel that vocation. It needs that much. And I fully agreed with the list of principles that Jake listed, and also some that, all that Daphne touched on as well. But I would say that something that perhaps has been implicit but not explicit and should be a principle is the principle of social justice and equity. It really does matter whose content is there online, and it really does matter who decides what is culturally important. And issues of equity and impartiality and right to speak and right to be heard are implicit in everything that we're doing, and they must be explicit, therefore, and not just implicit, if we're to do our job properly. So one argument for what we have in the sector is that of the public service argument and the role we can play. And I think on top of that, we also need to articulate what is different about what cultural heritage offers, online as well as in real life. Anybody who, like me, started off as a school teacher and then ended up as an education officer in a museum will know that the way in which school children respond, behave, and think in a gallery or exhibition context is very, very different from that in which they behave anywhere else, but particularly in the school classroom. With interesting, inspiring, different, challenging, disturbing sometimes objects, works of art, spaces, places, children, adults, everybody has a different experience, different way to experience than they would have in other contexts in life. They also learn differently as well. The number of school teachers have come up to me after a session in a gallery and said that they were completely surprised by the way certain children who were not engaged in a classroom were deeply engaged in a museum gallery context. In the number of occasions have been legion. You learn differently from cultural heritage objects and buildings and images than you do from other things. And therefore underlying this also is a different way of thinking, which very often is non-linear and social and collaborative as well. The third thing, as well as public service and distinctiveness as heritage, that I think we have to argue for is place. And this building itself is an example of that, with its sort of hymn to these stones. The cultural distinctiveness of place. No place is exactly like any other. Places themselves can be threatening or inspiring. They carry their own stories and memories, often into deep time. They influence profoundly how one feels, and therefore how one creates and how one expresses oneself. They carry their own hurts and secrets. They are inevitably social, and they are a locus for co-production. And they're a really important source of diversity and creativity. And if we do not factor place into our thinking about the digital, we will lose, I would argue, almost half the potential richness of the digital developments. And our future is not in the victory of digital over the physical, but in, ideally, the interaction and ideally the harmony of those two things. Thank you.
Okay, a lot of ideas there, a lot of very passionately expressed ideas too. Just quickly, I think, from trying to sum up those different things, I think the idea of free access, I think, is at the heart of this. But I think you're going back from a technical perspective at the start, that free access begins by having a common standard on which they're built and having an open access. If you don't have that, if you don't have that at the start, you have nothing coming out the other end. I think the issue around where those archives are from and how they're organised, I think, was coming up just there. The social equity, I think, and the equality and that availability that anyone can, and we would hope would contribute from wherever, I think is a really important thing, but it comes with challenges and just the sheer scale of what you've got. That scale, I think we heard, is partly problematic because of things like copyright, which are still a problem. I think when we go through the questions, I think copyright may become is a very big issue still. And it then crosses over this idea of exploitation that I think you were discussing here, that I think this is a really complex area that I think we'll come back to in questions if they haven't been raised here already, which is what is there to be exploited commercially? Where does the commercial exploitation cut across and contradict public access? And actually, if you allow things to be broken up, so some things are public and some things are private, there are contradictions in there too. While we get the questions up, if we can, let me just ask you one question at the start, just to kick us off. We talked a lot about people putting the stuff in, and we talked about a lot about where the archive comes from and that access. But is there any evidence that that there's different kind of people, a broader range of people are accessing archives online? Because we still have that problem with our cultural institutions. To me, that there are very active supporters in some areas, but there are areas where, particularly of poverty and deprivation, and particularly, I mean, certain social groups from all kinds of reasons don't access and don't feel it's their archive. Does digital change that? Is there anything that suggests that what we're already doing is changing the demographics and the nature of the people going? Who would like to kick us off? Jake, maybe you could start.
I think it does. Digital does change everything. The thing about about linked open data on the web is that the systems that look for it don't know and don't care who it comes from. If it's published in a certain way, then certainly on our system, the spiders that we send out onto the web will find it, will bring it back in, and will do something with it. So in that sense, an assertion that I make about a picture or anybody else does is no different from that of a grand institution. I think in that sense, it does kind of democratise it, where I guess the potential complexity that comes in from that is around the provenance and the value of expertise, and so that's what you kind of play off against each other.
And David, I think you were kind of talking about this to an extent. I guess some of this is about space as well. I mean, is the social space, the environment in which you're looking at things online, different, more democratic or less democratic? And is there anything in what you were saying at the end there that suggests that there's more openness, there's more democracy in the kind of way we're now doing things in a way that can be measured?
I think these are matters of choices, really. One project I could have mentioned, which I was involved in, is now more than a decade old, but I think it's still potentially interesting, called Every Object Tells a Story, and a collaboration between Ultralab, then part of Anglia University, Channel 4 and the V&A when I was working there. And we recommissioned an old London taxi and put a video camera in the back of it, and grounds, sort of town centres, community centres and everything, and invited people to bring an object that was particularly important to them and to tell the story of it in front of the camera, which was recorded and then uploaded, or to do that online as well. I do think that if we had left it as a purely digital project and not included that very, very important physical and going to you in your community elements, I think that there would have been less diverse content in it. I don't think that there's any measure that's purely digital that would achieve that equity. And one of the really important things about the People's Collection Wales is that it actually goes to communities for maybe a weekend and trains people in the community and helps and encourages them to have the skills to upload content about that local community. So I think we have to be proactive on that, and it's why I personally can never look at digital as purely digital. It's always taking place in a space, even if it's in a studio or a room. There is always a social context, a political context in a way, and an element of justice or social injustice built into it. You have to have the physical space as part of the answer to that question.
And I think that's a really important point, because when you were talking earlier on about space, I was kind of thinking museums, but actually space, you mean that physical interaction, that feeling it belongs somewhere. I
mean everywhere,
yeah.
Yes. And there's choices all the time on that.
Okay. And Duff, I think you were talking about, in some ways, the same thing. You were talking about the way that people engage with the content, the stuff that you've also tried many of these same things. That digital, you end up with lots of ones and zeros. Effectively, you end up with huge numbers of files. But maybe we can cut straight to that question. Are there new and novel uses? Are there novel forms of engagement that you're looking at now and thinking this is changing the relationship between library and content and the consumer?
I can think of a range of different types of project that I alluded to in the presentation, but just didn't have time to mention. That we have a crowdsourcing project where we try to engage users in a way that will enrich some of the mapping information that we have about 19th century Wales during the 1900. We've been doing some crowdsourcing also with Aberystwyth shipping registers. But as the main point at the end of my presentation really is that we need to gather more evidence that will demonstrate the value and the impact that these digital collections are making. I can give examples of. Yeah. Well, this is the starting point for me really. It's the direction that we've been taking has been based on an assumption that there's a public benefit to be gained from sharing collections in this way. What we need is to build a body of evidence that really demonstrates that and shows.
I mean, I'm just trying to work out what that body of evidence is. Yeah, please.
A couple of examples, really. Well, one I'll probably leave till tomorrow because I don't want to steal the thunder of the iBeacons discussion. But I think that is a game changer, really, and in a way would very, very ably answer that question very directly. But I'll give a very simple example from a few years ago from another museum. You start off with the William Burgess tile. On that, there are maybe half a dozen separate image elements. You disaggregate those digitally. You offer them as a some of those elements to do it. And when the museum did that, they began to find that thousands and thousands and thousands of new designs of tile, some of which had been manipulated beyond any recognition of the original, some of which were being designed jointly by two people across the world from each other. One would design and then another would alter and then another one would re-alter again, would go on. And that was about unlocking creativity, but it's also about teaching something about how tiles are designed. You couldn't go back to the William Burgess tile afterwards and look at that with the same eyes once you'd seen that project go live.
So it's that active engagement. It brings you closer to the idea that history isn't something that's just in those black and white photographs. It's something with which you can engage. And I guess that's the novel use that you're kind of pointing out here. Is there another?
I mean, just quickly in response to that question, I think the most exciting thing is that we don't know what will happen. I mean, nobody ever can predict the outcome of their decisions. I mean, did the engineer who created the first modern, Roman road, or even Henry Ford when he invented the motor car, did he imagine Heston Blumenthal at Little Chef and roundabout appreciation societies and dogging? Who knows?
He wouldn't
Who
have
knows?
Would he?
No.
Okay, I guess this question is going back, the idea of engaging new audiences, that one I was asking you at the beginning to an extent, which is digital exclusion still seems to me an issue, and it's when we talk. I mean, it's been very refreshing, to be honest. This isn't the same conversation that I had at an archive event last year in Brussels or one in London, where it was all about how do we gather up more and more stuff. This seems to me to point to the idea that digital is great in theory, but it's that difference between I can make something theoretically accessible to anybody and actually engaging them so that you're reaching people who weren't otherwise going to do this. Is there some evidence or some thoughts around this?
Can I throw that? The human rights theories and work that's been done on that are very relevant. Culture, after all, is one of the 5 key elements of human rights. It's one that is very often neglected. And I am sometimes surprised that the cultural sector in the UK, for example, isn't more arguing the case for their future because they are one of the primary deliverers of the means by which people get access to their rights. One of the key elements of that theory is that, as I mentioned briefly, that rights only exist through participation. And that is something that's very challenging for lots of cultural organisations, traditional cultural organisations. They're not used to the idea of the public having a voice or a role. If you go back to a gallery of the late 19th and much of the 20th century, control of thought was by the label, by the publication, by the rights on the image in the book, virtually total control really being exercised by the cultural mandarins. That in itself is not enabling people to enact their cultural rights. And what we have in Wales is our organisations, the National Library, I hope ourselves and the museum and others, that are taking a very different approach to cultural rights, which is that they exist only in participation. And therefore, if the audiences are not part of the driving of that, and that includes digital, then exclusion will continue. If we tell people that they can't contribute by default, then we exclude them in every way, not just in that way.
Yeah, and maybe that's the point of the even more excluded is kind of an interesting thought.
And gaining a better reaching, and if we could be more effective in knowing who uses our collections and how they're using it, then we can identify ways in which we can perhaps reach out to those digitally excluded.
Okay, there's a question at the front here. Is that Peter? I think it is Peter.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, just to say that, you know, the expression that the three of you have given of the material, the institutions you have, is just a magnificent expression of what is available there. But I think the kind of thing which Mike has been driving towards is really interesting as well, because it's essentially passive. You have to be passive in many ways. The material is there. You want other people to engage with it. Of course you do. Nobody has talked about the artist and the entrepreneur. And the artist and the entrepreneur essentially are driven by the need to make a dollar. And to me, those are the people who interpret or sell or exploit, those horrible words, David, that sells the material to the larger audience. And that, to me, you know, with the Charter Review, all that stuff, possibly another coalition government, all of that stuff puts the work that you lot have done in danger, unless we find a way of working with the artist and the entrepreneur and that's my challenge as well, somebody who's worked in the TV and film business for 35 years. What the hell do I do with all that material that I've produced all those years? How is it reimagined, reinterpreted, and how do I make some money out of it?
I mean, if I can, with the research and education space project, which I mentioned, it very deliberately and explicitly was decided from the start that the BBC and JISC and co would create a platform that made access to a huge amount of material a lot easier and more efficient. What we're not going to do is build any user-facing products and services on that. For that, we're going to look entirely at other organisations, whether they be private companies, individuals, or any other kind. So there we are hoping and expecting that we will very much stimulate elements of the commercial industry, but do it on a very level playing field. So we're not going to be signing agreements with software company X to build something on top of it. We're going to say, here is a system. It has all of the kind of usage rights, metadata included with it. Go and build stuff, and if it's good enough, people will buy it.
This has kind of been a theme coming through the day, actually, earlier on when we were talking about digital business models, that you still end up with this idea that a smaller number of people are making things who can afford to make things, because actually there isn't really a great business model for that. So we end up here again with a world where audiences theoretically have much more access to something, but the producers who would make money, perhaps some of the people we're talking about here, the tile makers, the designers, the artists, in the current world, it doesn't seem to be able to make any money as a creator seems problematic in this world.
I think it's hard to avoid geography in this as well, because if you look at what's been happening to the creative industries, creative economy in the UK over the last decade or so, more and more that's being sucked into London. And so there is a particular challenge in Wales, for example, to actually sustain our creative economy and a livelihood, if you like, for people who work in design and other industries. And I don't think that, again, the public sector can turn its back on that issue. And I do think that there are two things that we can do. The first one is that I do believe a creative economy relies on a creative society. So therefore, encouraging creative use of our resources from early childhood onwards is a vital responsibility. And then I think the second thing is what Jake was referring to, which is to try to ensure that there are resources of all kinds, really, digital resources and others as well. Some research which has been done elsewhere suggests that many people working in the creative economies are actually very often singletons or working in very small groups, really. They're not necessarily all large advertising agencies. And they very often lack opportunities to have public places, really, to meet and to just really socialise with each other, even as much as anything else. And that's something, again, which museums and other public culture organisations can provide. We can organise those sorts of events. I have to say we're not doing very much at the moment, but we could do more. So I think we have to be part of the ecology of all this, and there are a number of different things, digital being an important one, which we can add to that.
Yeah, and I think your point on the Creative Society, if you have this discussion in France, they wonder what the hell we're talking about, because culture is obviously part of the overall economy. The idea of not investing and not putting public money, and that is just nonsense. But here it seems like we still haven't had that discussion about culture's place in society in that same way, digital or not. Can we just go through a few questions? Is there any more questions from the audience at this point? Okay, let's just quickly go through your Twitter questions, where you seem to have asked a few. This sounds like a technical one for who digitises the National Library. Do we want names and addresses?
It's the National Library itself. We've, as I mentioned in my presentation, over the course of several digitisation projects, we've been able to build a capacity for mass digitisation. And sometimes when I speak to people who, within other cultural organisations, that is the question that they ask first, is who's the commercial partner in this? And we can say quite proudly that it's all done in-house, and that may create potential collaborations there, because there are certain advantages to being able to digitise on that scale ourselves.
A colleague of mine basically always said, never outsource your core purpose. And in a modern age, then digital representations of your stuff, as well as the physical thing, is a core purpose, and you should be. I think people should be doing it themselves.
Cool. Do we have some others? Is there a dedicated cross promotion? I guess that means is that different public institutions working together so that you're actually cross promoting all of the kind of different archives across Wales. Are you all working together, or are they separate institutions?
We're working together in the context of the People's Collection, which is one area. But as David mentioned, we're also developing a digital strategy for the cultural heritage, where, well, the museum and the library in particular are working quite closely at the moment. So another good example is the BBC Your Paintings project, which has been a great way to promote artworks that are in publicly funded organisations, and it's been a great success for gaining exposure to our collections.
I think one should add as well that Visit Wales has started doing a great deal more to promote the cultural resources of Wales than perhaps was the case in the past, and I think that's going to be increasingly manifested digitally as well as in other ways.
Yeah, I think the institutions thing is interesting, and as much as we still often operate. I mean, film's quite a good example, actually, where what is film in a digital environment compared to television? But you still work within your silos, and that's quite difficult to get past. But maybe that's an ongoing process. Is there another one on there? I think we've kind of touched on this, the passivity. I think you were kind of arguing a case that that's an ongoing.
Yes, I mean, I think it's a fair cop for museums and galleries, that one. I don't think anybody would deny that, but I think it is changing.
Yeah.
And, resources allowing, we'll change it as quickly as we can.
Okay. Sponsors and private funding, I imagine very important. How, anyone got some examples? In terms of percentages, all this digital archive stuff, how much of that is private money as compared to public money?
For us, there's no private money.
Right.
Predominantly public money. I am aware that some of the big sort of companies like Google, for example, have worked with Science Museum, Barbican, and so on as well on projects.
But is there anything in it for a big private institution? Could you see? You could have the McDonald's archive of Wales.
We always would do due diligence on our sponsorship, but I think that with due diligence, then it can be a positive, and I think that we are all very careful about, and I know the BBC is in a special case here, we're all very careful about the implications, the reputational and other implications of partnerships. But having said that, there are plenty of potential commercial partners and sponsors who really are committed to the public good in the project they're doing with us.
So if we come to you with loads of money, you'll be willing to talk.
That's one way of putting it. I wouldn't put it quite like that.
That's it. Okay, well, that's perfect timing on this Twitter thing. It works well. Okay, well, I think we went through a hell of a lot of ground there. I think at the end of it, I felt quite inspired that the principles and the ideas behind it seem to be uniting you all, and they're not actually, we shouldn't take those for granted. Those thoughts about free access, the methods by which they're done, and that commitment and belief that how you collect and to make them socially available, that commitment seems to me an ongoing process, but one that you're absolutely committed to. So I think thanks to the audience, and then we've got time for a quick break, I think. If I remind you again, the R1 Lounge is showing some internet service providers and some innovation work, and you've got 15 minutes to do whatever you do in 15 minutes. Thank you. Love that. Really